They say silence has a sound. Out on the Dakota Plains in 1877, that sound was a living thing. For 10-year-old Arthur Prescott, it was the sound of a ghost. The ghost of his mother's voice, which used to fill every corner of their small, rough-hewn cabin. Now there was just nothing. A hollow space where laughter used to be. A quiet so heavy it felt like you could suffocate on it. His father, Garrett, was the architect of this silence. He moved like a shadow, his face carved from granite, his words few and far between. Grief hadn't pulled them together. No, it had built a wall between them, a wall as high and unforgiving as the endless sky. Every chore, every meal, was done with a grim efficiency that just made the quiet louder. Garrett was a man who had buried his heart in the same unforgiving soil he worked day in and day out. Arthur couldn't remember the last time his father's hands had been gentle. They were tools now, calloused and stiff, made for an axe handle or a rifle stock, not for ruffling a son's hair. The love was still there. Arthur had to believe it was, but it was buried so deep under sorrow and dust that its warmth could no longer reach him. Their talks were about the weather, about mending fences, about survival, never about the aching emptiness that sat between them at the dinner table. So the boy made friends with the land. He learned the language of the creek that snaked through the tall grass. He listened to the secrets the wind whispered in the cottonwoods. He watched the hawks circle overhead, patient and silent, and felt a kinship with them. Under his cot, in a loose-floored cache, he kept his treasures: a hawk's feather, a fossil of a tiny ancient shell, and his favorite, a piece of rose quartz that seemed to hold the sunset trapped inside it. These were his only companions. His life was a loop: fetch water, check snares, mend fences, and watch his father's back grow smaller as he walked out to the fields. It was a life of quiet desperation, a boy trapped in a past he couldn't get back, with a future he couldn't imagine. And then one afternoon, everything changed. He was checking his rabbit snares down by the creek when a flicker of color caught his eye. A splash of faded red and blue where there should only be browns and greens. Curiosity, a feeling so rare it felt foreign, pulled him closer. He pushed through a tangle of wild plum bushes, his heart starting to beat a little faster. And then he saw her, lying by the water's edge, an old woman. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her silver-white hair spread out against the dry earth like a fan. She was Lakota, her deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that held a quiet dignity, even covered in dust. For a terrifying second, she was perfectly still. A cold knot of fear tightened in Arthur's stomach. He'd heard the stories in town, the hushed, hostile whispers about the Sioux. He'd seen the way his father's hand would instinctively go to his pistol whenever a lone rider appeared on the horizon. These were the enemy, the defeated warriors of the Black Hills. That's what he'd been taught. But looking at her, he didn't see an enemy. He saw the slow, shallow rise and fall of her chest. He saw the cracked skin of her lips. He saw an exhaustion that seemed to have settled into her very bones. This wasn't a warrior. This was a grandmother, lost, alone, dying. His father's rules, the harsh, rigid code of the frontier, screamed at him to run, to go back to the cabin and say nothing. But another voice, a softer one that sounded a lot like his mother's, whispered something else. Kindness, she had taught him, wasn't something you only spent on your own kind. It was a wellspring inside you, and if you never used it, your soul would turn to dust. He looked at the old woman, collapsed and helpless under that immense, indifferent sky. He saw a human being. Kneeling beside her, he uncorked his canteen. He gently lifted her head, her skin as fragile as old paper, and let a trickle of water touch her lips. Her eyelids fluttered. Dark, intelligent eyes, clouded with fatigue, flickered open and focused on him. They held no fear. Only a deep weariness, and maybe a flicker of surprise. In that single moment, Arthur made a choice that would either save them all or get them killed. He wasn't leaving her there. He was taking her home. Getting her to her feet was a battle. She was impossibly weak, leaning almost all of her weight on his small 10-year-old frame. Every single step was a monumental effort. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, painful shuffle. the sun beating down on them. And with every footstep closer to home, a cold dread grew in Arthur's stomach. This wasn't a stray puppy he was bringing home. He was bringing a lightning storm right to his father's front door. And there he was, Garrett, splitting logs by the barn, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound in the world. He stopped mid-swing, his whole body going rigid, his eyes, cold as frozen river stones, narrowed. He took in the scene in a single hostile glance. His son, half carrying an old Sioux woman. He dropped the axe. It clattered against the woodpile with a sound like a gunshot. He strode towards them, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and pure fury. "What in God's name are you doing, Arthur?" Garrett's voice was a low growl, an animal sound that made Arthur flinch. "Get away from her, now!" But Arthur held his ground. His voice was small, but it didn't tremble. "She was by the creek, Pa. She'd fallen. She needs water. Help." He kept his arm wrapped tight around the old woman's waist. It was a tiny act of defiance, but it felt like holding up a mountain. Garrett didn't even look at his son. His eyes were locked on the woman. He wasn't seeing her frailty, her age. He saw the beadwork on her dress. He saw the shape of her face. He saw a symbol of everything the world had taught him to fear and to hate. "She's Sue," he spat. "Do you have any idea the trouble you've just brought to this house? They could be looking for her. A war party." "She's old," Arthur insisted, his grip tightening. "She's just lost." The woman, whose name was Istus, though Arthur didn't know it yet, stood silently between them. She didn't understand the sharp, angry words, but she understood the meaning perfectly. She saw the father's terror, forged into a weapon of hate, and she saw the son's compassion, unwavering and pure. She looked from one face to the other, her ancient eyes holding a wisdom that seemed to stretch back for 1,000 years. For a long, stretched-out moment, Garrett just stared at his son. He saw the boy's jaw set in a stubborn line that was a perfect mirror of his own. He saw Arthur shielding the old woman, literally placing his own small body between her and his father's rage. And in that moment, something flickered in Garrett's cold eyes. A memory, maybe, of a wife who always took in stray things. Or maybe a glimpse of the son he was losing, day by day, to the suffocating silence. With a ragged sigh that sounded like a man being broken, he turned away. "The barn," he grunted, his voice clipped and raw. "She can stay in the barn, but she's gone by morning. You understand me, Arthur? Gone." It wasn't kindness. It was a ceasefire, a bitter, reluctant truce in a war Arthur hadn't even known they were fighting. Arthur led Istus into the dim, dusty air of the barn. The smell of hay and old leather was thick around them. He made a bed for her out of clean straw in an empty stall. He brought her a bucket of fresh water from the well and a bowl of leftover stew from the cabin. Garrett watched from the cabin doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his whole body a wall of disapproval. But then, as Arthur turned to leave, Garrett did something strange. He strode over to the large barn door, slid the heavy wooden beam across it, and dropped the iron latch into place. He locked her in. Arthur stared, confused. "Pa, why'd you do that?" Garrett didn't look at him. "She's not wandering off in the night. She's gone in the morning. That's the deal." His voice was flat, final. But as he walked back to the cabin, Arthur saw him touch the pistol at his hip, a gesture of pure, primal fear. His father wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Sleep wouldn't come. Arthur lay in his cot, listening to his father's restless breathing from the other room. The image of that heavy beam sliding across the barn door was burned into his mind. It felt wrong, cruel. It felt like locking up an animal, not a person, a grandmother. Long after the moon was high in the sky, he slipped out of his bed. The floorboards groaned under his bare feet, and he froze, listening. But Garrett didn't stir. Tiptoeing through the small cabin, Arthur grabbed the heavy wool blanket from the foot of his parents' old bed. His mother had woven it. The pattern of blue and gray was as familiar and comforting as her face in his memories. He crept out into the chilly night air. The world was bathed in silver. He went to the barn's side window, a small opening just big enough for him to squeeze through. Inside, the air was still and quiet. He found Istus awake. She was sitting perfectly upright in the straw, her back as straight as a queen's on a throne. She watched him approach in the moonlight that streamed through the high window, her expression impossible to read. He didn't say a word. He just unfolded the heavy blanket and gently draped it over her thin shoulders. She reached up, and her fingers, surprisingly strong, brushed against the soft wool. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, a small, faint smile touched her cracked lips. It was a smile that crossed the vast canyon of language and culture between them. It was a simple thank you, acknowledgement of a kindness given when none was expected. Arthur sat with her for a while in the quiet dark. He found himself talking, his voice a low whisper. He told her about his secret collection of treasures. He told her about the hawk he watched every day, how it owned the sky. He told her about his mother. He didn't know if she understood a single word, but she listened, her head cocked, her dark eyes never leaving his face. She seemed to understand not the words, but the boy's profound need to speak them, to fill the silence that had been eating him alive. As he talked, he noticed the small leather pouch at her belt. It was old, the deer skin worn smooth, and she kept one hand resting on it, almost unconsciously. It was clear that whatever was inside was precious to her. A fragile connection began to form there in the dusty silence of the barn. A tiny seed of trust, planted in the hard, unforgiving soil of fear and suspicion. Before he left, she did something that surprised him. She reached out and touched the piece of rose quartz he always kept in his pocket. He'd taken it out to show her his treasures. Her fingers traced its shape, and a strange look passed over her face. A flicker of recognition, of pain. She murmured a soft Lakota word, a word that sounded like a question, but he couldn't understand. Then the moment passed, and she was just a tired old woman again. He squeezed back out the window, leaving her wrapped in his mother's blanket. But as he scurried back to the cabin, a new question echoed in his mind. Who was this woman? And what was she doing out here, all alone, so far from her people? It was starting to feel like she wasn't just lost. It felt like she was looking for something. The next morning, Istus was still too weak to travel. When Garrett saw she was still there, his jaw tightened into a hard knot of displeasure, but he didn't force the issue. Maybe he saw the blanket draped over her shoulders and knew his son had defied him. Maybe he was just too tired to fight. He went about his chores with a grim set to his shoulders, pointedly ignoring the barn and everything in it. But Arthur did not. He spent the day in and out of her presence, bringing her food and fresh water. He felt a strange new purpose. He wasn't just a lonely boy anymore. He was a caretaker. He showed her his prized hawk feather again, and she traced its delicate edge with her fingertip, murmuring another soft Lakota word. He showed her a tear in the knee of his trousers, and with slow, deliberate movements, she took a small bone needle and a strand of sinew from a pouch at her belt. She stitched the tear with a neat, strong pattern, her gnarled fingers moving with a practiced grace that was mesmerizing to watch. As he watched her work, a sharp pang of longing for his own mother hit him so hard it took his breath away. His mother's hands had once performed these same small acts of care, fixing his clothes, tending his scrapes. Istas seemed to sense the shift in his mood. She paused her sewing, looked at him, and reached out to gently touch his cheek. It was a gesture of profound comfort, a grandmother's touch. It said everything words couldn't. From a distance, Garrett watched them. He stood by the woodpile, his axe forgotten in his hand, his heart a battlefield. He saw his son, his quiet, withdrawn, solitary son, blossoming in the presence of this stranger. He saw Arthur smile, a real, genuine smile, the kind he hadn't seen in over a year. It was like watching the sun come out after a long winter. And he watched the old woman. He saw her quiet dignity, her complete lack of fear, her gentle responses to the boy's chattering. The hard shell of his prejudice, a shell baked solid by grief and the harsh paranoia of the frontier, began to show the faintest of cracks. He was still a man ruled by fear, by a past he never spoke of. But the image of this woman as a faceless, savage enemy was beginning to dissolve. It was being replaced by the undeniable reality of a person his son cared for, a person who was bringing his son back to life. That evening, something shifted. Garrett didn't lock the barn door. He just closed it. It was a small thing, but it felt enormous. Later, when the cabin was dark, Arthur heard a sound. He crept to his window and saw his father walking toward the barn, carrying a lantern. Garrett didn't go in. He just stood outside for a long time, a dark silhouette against the barn wall, bathed in the soft, yellow glow of the light. What was he thinking? What was he remembering? The next day, Arthur saw something that made his blood run cold. His father was cleaning his rifle. Not the quick wipe down he did after hunting. This was a deep clean. He was taking it completely apart, oiling every piece with a focused, grim intensity. He was checking his ammunition, counting the cartridges one by one. It was the way a man prepares for war. Arthur's fear was a cold stone in his gut. Was his father planning on forcing Istas to leave at gunpoint? Or was he afraid of something else? Was he expecting that war party he talked about? The fragile peace of the last 2 days shattered. The silence in the cabin was back. But now it wasn't empty. It was filled with the metallic scent of gun oil and a terrible, unspoken dread. On the third morning, Istas was stronger. She stood on her own, the blanket Arthur had given her folded neatly over one arm. She met him at the barn door and pointed to the east toward the rising sun. Then she touched her own chest. The meaning was clear. It was time for her to leave. She was thanking him. Arthur's heart sank. Her brief presence had been a small, warm light in his lonely world, and he wasn't ready for it to be extinguished. He felt like he was losing his mother all over again. As she prepared to go, Garrett emerged from the cabin. He walked over to them, his movements stiff and awkward. He didn't look at Istas directly. Instead, he held out a small, greasy parcel wrapped in cloth. "Jerky," he mumbled, pushing it into Arthur's hands to give to her. "For the journey." It was such a small offering, given so grudgingly, but it was a tectonic shift. It was an acknowledgement, a peace treaty. Istas took the parcel, and for the first time, she met Garrett's gaze directly. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, a sign of respect, from one survivor to another. Then she turned to Arthur. She placed her hand over his heart, her dark eyes holding his for a long, meaningful moment. It was a promise and a farewell all in one. Before she turned to leave, she pressed something small and hard into his palm. He opened his hand and saw it was a single, smooth, dark river stone. On one side, a symbol was scratched into its surface, a circle with a jagged line, like a lightning bolt, cutting through it. She closed his fingers over it, then turned and walked away. She was a small, solitary figure, shrinking against the vastness of the prairie, until, finally, she was gone. The silence that returned to the homestead felt heavier than ever before. It was the silence of a new, more profound loneliness. Arthur clutched the stone in his hand. It was the only proof she had ever been there at all. Weeks turned into a month. The memory of Istas began to fade, softened by the daily grind of survival. But the change she had brought remained. The wall between Arthur and his father hadn't crumbled, but now there were doors in it. Garrett spoke more. He asked Arthur about his snares. He listened when the boy talked about the tracks he'd found by the creek. It was a fragile thaw, a new beginning. But the frontier is a place that does not allow for peace to last. The new trouble arrived on horseback. There were 3 of them, hard-faced men with greedy, avaricious eyes. Their leader was a man with a stained duster and a cruel smile named Vance. They were land prospectors, but they weren't interested in empty land. They were interested in Garrett's land. They saw his deeded homestead not as a home, but as a piece on a map they wanted for themselves. Their first visit was all veiled threats and oily smiles. Vance offered Garrett a laughably small sum for his land, his eyes sweeping over the small but well-kept cabin, the sturdy barn, the newly turned fields. "Lonely spot out here for a man and a boy," Vance had said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Things happen, accidents. Might be easier to take my offer and move on." Garrett was not a man to be intimidated. His claim was legal, bought and paid for with the last of his and his wife's savings. This land was all he had left of their dream. He stood his ground, his hand never far from the pistol at his hip, and told Vance and his men to get off his property. They left, but the air they left behind was poisoned. As they rode away, Vance shouted something back at Garrett. "You're sitting on a fortune, And you're too stupid to even know it, Prescott. But I know. The old stories are true. Garrett's face went pale. Fortune? What fortune? Their land was good for farming, nothing more. But Vance's words had planted a seed of doubt. The peace they had just started to build was about to be burned to the ground. The conflict escalated just as Vance had promised. It started small and mean. A section of their fence was cut in the night, allowing the few cattle they owned to wander off into the prairie. It took Garrett and Arthur 2 days to round them all up. Then a week later, they woke up to find their well, their only source of fresh water, had been fouled. Someone had thrown a dead animal into it, poisoning their lifeline and forcing them to haul water, bucket by painful bucket, from the creek a half-mile away. Each act was an anonymous strike in the dark, a coward's blow designed to wear them down, to make life so unbearable that they would have no choice but to sell. Arthur lived in a state of constant, humming fear. Every creak of the cabin at night, every snap of a twig in the woods, made him jump. His sleep was plagued by nightmares of cruel, smiling faces and shadowy figures. But the shared threat forged a new, grim bond between father and son. The fragile thaw became a hardened alliance. Garrett's face was a mask of etched worry, but his eyes held a new kind of fire. One afternoon, he took Arthur out behind the barn and placed the heavy rifle in his hands, the same rifle he'd cleaned so meticulously just weeks before. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice quiet and deadly serious. "Not to go looking for a fight, but to finish one if it comes to you." The lessons were a somber rite of passage. As Arthur learned to load, aim, and fire, he felt the last vestiges of his childhood burning away like gunpowder. The kick of the rifle against his small shoulder was a brutal shock, a violent jolt into manhood. He and his father were no longer just a grieving man and a lonely boy. They were a garrison of two, defending their tiny patch of existence against a hostile world. One evening, as they sat by the fire, cleaning their weapons in a tense silence, Arthur got up the courage to ask, "Pa, what did that man Vance mean when he said we were sitting on a fortune?" Garrett stopped what he was doing. He stared into the fire for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Your mother, she loved this land. She used to walk it for hours. She had a collection of rocks like you. Pretty things she found. She said this land had a heart, a good heart." He shook his head as if waking from a dream. "It's just talk, Arthur. Old prospector nonsense. He wants the water rights. That's all." But Arthur wasn't so sure. He thought of his own collection, hidden under his cot. He thought of his rose quartz, the one that held the sunset. He thought of the strange, intense look on Istus's face when she had touched it. Could it be possible? Could Vance be after something more than just their land? The inevitable confrontation came on a moonless, starless night. A shout from outside jolted them from a tense, watchful supper. "Prescott, we know you're in there. We're tired of being patient." It was Vance's voice amplified by the oppressive darkness. Peeking through a crack in the shutters, Garrett could see them. It wasn't just 3 men anymore. Vance had brought 2 more. They were dark silhouettes on horseback, circling the cabin like vultures. And in the hand of one of them, a torch flared to life, its hungry orange light dancing across the cabin walls, painting everything in terrifying shades of black and red. "They mean to burn us out," Garrett whispered, his voice dangerously calm. He was a different man now. The fear was still there, but it had been forged into something harder, something unbreakable. He pushed the heavy wooden table against the door and handed Arthur the rifle. "Stay away from the window," he commanded. "Don't fire unless I tell you to. Do you understand?" Arthur nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. He huddled by the hearth, the rifle clutched in his hands, its wooden stock slick with his sweat. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might break right through. He could hear their jeering laughter, their drunken shouts. He could smell the acrid, oily scent of the torch. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and utterly, completely alone. Hope was a dwindling ember, and a boot was coming down, ready to stomp it into ash. The siege began. A shot rang out, and wood splintered from the doorframe, inches from Garrett's head. Another shot shattered the single pane of glass in the loft window, showering the floor with glittering shards. Garrett returned fire sparingly, aiming not to kill, but to keep them at bay. Their ammunition was limited, and every shot had to count. "Give it up, Prescott!" Vance yelled. "There's 5 of us. You can't win. Just give us the map and we'll let the boy live." A map? Arthur looked at his father, his eyes wide with confusion. Garrett's face was a stone mask. He fired another shot into the darkness. "I don't know what you're talking about," he yelled back, his voice raw. "Don't play dumb," Vance laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "The map your wife made, the one that marks the Heartstone, we know you have it." Garrett froze. Arthur could feel the shock that went through his father's body. The map. His mother's drawings. She had made dozens of them, detailed sketches of the land, marking where she found interesting flowers or strange rock formations. Garrett had kept them, tied in a bundle with a piece of twine, in the bottom of her old trunk. And the Heartstone, that was her name for Arthur's rose quartz. She'd found it with him when he was just a toddler, and told him it was the heart of the prairie. It was just a child's story. How could Vance know about that? Just as Vance's men began to advance on the cabin, the torch held high, ready to set the dry timber of the porch ablaze, a new sound cut through the night. It was a sound that didn't belong to the prairie crickets or the wind. It started as a low, deep thrumming, a vibration you felt in your bones before you heard it with your ears. It grew steadily, a powerful, rhythmic beat that seemed to rise up from the earth itself. Boom, 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 boom. It was the sound of a war drum. Then another joined in, and then human voices rising in a powerful chant, a song of strength and fury that rolled across the plains like a tidal wave. Vance and his men froze. Their drunken bravado evaporated in an instant. They turned, their faces pale in the torchlight, peering into the impenetrable darkness beyond the small circle of their light. And then they saw them. On the low ridge that overlooked the homestead, silhouettes began to appear. First 1, then 5, then 20, then more. A line of mounted warriors, their forms stark and imposing against the star-dusted sky. They were armed for battle, their lances and feathered war bonnets creating a terrifying and magnificent spectacle against the heavens. A panicked cry went up from one of Vance's men. "It's the Sioux! It's the dog soldiers!" The name itself was enough to strike ice-cold fear into their hearts. The dog soldiers, the Kangi Shunka, were one of the most elite and fiercely disciplined warrior societies of the Lakota nation. They were the guardians, the protectors. They were not a random raiding party. They were a symbol of absolute, unbreakable resolve. They were a death sentence. The warriors didn't charge. They just sat upon their horses, a silent, formidable wall of judgment, their drumming and chanting the only sound in the world. Then the line parted, and 2 figures rode forward into the torchlight. One was a tall, powerful warrior whose face bore the calm, deadly authority of a leader. The other, riding beside him, was the small, stooped figure of an old woman. In the flickering, dancing light, Arthur saw her face. It was Istus. She had returned, and she had not come alone. Vance stared, his jaw slack with a mixture of disbelief and pure animal terror. The small, insignificant squatter he had been trying to bully from his land was somehow under the protection of a Lakota war society. This wasn't a 5-on-2 fight anymore. This was a slaughter waiting to happen. The warrior leader, who Arthur would later learn was named Chotten, and was Istus's son, nudged his horse forward a few paces. He didn't shout. He didn't make a threat. He simply looked at Vance, his eyes as hard and unyielding as the ancient rock of the Black Hills. The message needed no translation. This land is protected. These people are protected. Leave or be erased from the earth. Without another word, Vance wheeled his horse around. His men, scrambling in panic, followed his lead. They spurred their mounts into a desperate, clumsy gallop, fleeing into the night as if the devil himself were on their heels. They vanished, their drunken threats and cowardly violence swallowed up by the vast silent prairie. The threat wasn't just neutralized, It was annihilated. The dog soldiers hadn't needed to fire a single shot, hadn't loosed a single arrow. Their presence was a weapon more powerful than any rifle. The drumming stopped. The chanting faded. A profound, ringing quiet fell over the homestead. The cabin door creaked open. Garrett and Arthur stepped out into the night air, which now felt blessedly cool and clean. The torch lay sputtering on the ground, a small, dying flame. Before them, the Lakota warriors remained, their duty done. Istas and Chotin dismounted and walked towards them. Garrett stood frozen, his rifle hanging loosely in his hand. He was humbled, awestruck. He had prepared to die defending his home with violence and iron will, only to be saved by a power he could never have conceived of. The power of a debt of honor, the power of a single act of kindness. Chotin stopped a few feet away. He spoke in halting but clear English. My mother, Istas, became lost. She was on a journey to find something that was stolen from our people. He glanced in the direction Vance had fled. She said a boy with a brave heart gave her water and shelter. She said his father, though afraid, gave her food for her journey. He then gestured to the surrounding land. This is your home. No one will trouble you again. The kindness you showed to one was a kindness shown to our family, to our society. Istas stepped forward, past her son. She looked at Arthur, and her wrinkled face broke into a genuine, warm smile that lit up her ancient eyes. She held out her hand. In her palm lay a small amulet, a smooth gray stone wrapped in intricately beaded leather and tied to a rawhide cord. From it hung a single, perfect hawk's feather. For the boy who is a friend to hawks, Chayton translated her soft words, and to grandmothers. Arthur reached out with a trembling hand and took the gift. He slipped the cord over his head, the stone cool against his skin. He looked from the amulet to the old woman's kind eyes and felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with connection, with family. Garrett slowly, deliberately lowered his rifle, letting it rest against the cabin wall. He stepped forward and stood beside his son, placing a heavy, steadying hand on his shoulder. He looked at Chotin and then at Istas, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod, the very same gesture of respect she had given him weeks before. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The words felt small, hopelessly inadequate for the magnitude of what had just happened. Chotin looked from Garrett to Arthur. Vance spoke of a map and a heartstone. My mother believes you have it. It is a sacred object to our people, a relic he has been hunting for years. He followed my mother, thinking she would lead him to it. Garrett's blood ran cold. He looked at Arthur, and a dawning, impossible understanding passed between them. It wasn't just land or water. It was never about the land. It was about Arthur's rock. Arthur's hand went instinctively to his pocket. He pulled out the familiar worn piece of rose quartz. In the moonlight, it seemed to glow with a soft, internal light of its own. He held it out on his open palm. Istas's eyes widened. She let out a soft gasp and spoke a string of rapid Lakota words. Chotin translated, his voice filled with reverence. The heart of the mountain. It was lost to our people 2 generations ago. Legend said it would be returned by one with a pure heart, a child of 2 worlds. We thought it was just a story. He looked at Arthur, then at the stone, then back at Arthur. My mother was not just lost, boy. She was following a vision that led her here, to you. The whole story clicked into place, every confusing piece locking together with a sudden, shocking clarity. Vance hadn't been after water rights. He was a treasure hunter, a thief, chasing an old Lakota legend. He must have tortured the information about the stone and the map out of someone. He had stalked Istas, believing she would lead him to the prize. He never imagined the prize was already in the pocket of a 10-year-old boy. And Garrett. Garrett's fear, his intense hostility, it wasn't just general prejudice. He had never spoken of it, but his wife, Arthur's mother, had been killed not by sickness, but during a raid on their previous homestead, by men very much like Vance. Men who were falsely rumored to be natives, a lie spread to stir up hatred and fear. Garrett's grief was tangled up with a deep, misdirected terror of the very people who had just saved his life. Garrett seemed to shrink, the weight of it all crashing down on him. He looked at his son holding a sacred relic. He looked at the Lakota grandmother who had been guided here by a spiritual vision. He looked at the elite warriors who had ridden through the night to repay a debt for a bowl of stew and a wool blanket. His entire worldview, built on a foundation of pain, fear, and loss, had been shattered into a million pieces. Arthur looked at the stone in his hand. It was his most prized possession, a link to his own mother. But he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that it did not belong to him. It never had. He walked forward and gently placed the rose quartz into Istas's outstretched hands. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the assembled warriors. Istas closed her hands around the stone, holding it to her chest, and her eyes filled with tears. She looked at Arthur, a look of such profound gratitude and love that it felt like the sun rising in his own heart. The dog soldiers did not linger. With another nod from Chatton, they mounted their horses. Istas and her son did the same. As silently and mysteriously as they had appeared, they melted back into the night, leaving the father and son alone under the vast star-filled sky. Garrett's hand remained on Arthur's shoulder. He looked down at his son, and for the first time in over a year, he truly saw him. He saw not a child's naivete, but a strength more profound than his own. He saw a heart whose capacity for compassion had not just saved their lives, but had healed old wounds, returned a lost treasure, and fulfilled a prophecy. The ice that had encased Garrett's heart for so long finally, irrevocably, broke. He knelt, pulling his son into an embrace so tight it hurt, and for the first time since his wife had died, Garrett Prescott wept. He cried for his loss, for his fear, for his hatred, and for the beautiful, terrible, miraculous second chance he had just been given. They stood there for a long time, watching the ridge where the warriors had disappeared. The vast prairie no longer seemed empty or threatening. It felt full. It was a place of astonishing possibilities, a place where a single small act of kindness could ripple outward and return as a tidal wave of salvation. The silence that settled over the homestead now was not one of absence or grief. It was a new quiet, filled with unspoken understanding, shared gratitude, and the enduring promise of a love that had, against all odds, found its way home. They had faced the darkest parts of the human heart that night, greed, hatred, and violence. But they had been saved by the best of it, courage, honor, and a young boy's simple, powerful kindness. The story of the boy who befriended a grandmother would be told around Lakota campfires for generations. A story about how even in the hardest of lands, the most powerful thing in the universe isn't a rifle or a claim to a piece of dirt. It's a heart that is open. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. And let me know in the comments below. What would you have done if you were Arthur? Thanks for watching.